All right, today we're going to talk about the characteristics of fungi. Remember, we're going through each of the kingdoms and sort of talking about their major characteristics, benefits, and detrimental things that they can also do. So, fungi are eukaryotic, just like protista and plants and animals. Remember, our only prokaryotic organisms were bacteria. So they are eukaryotic. They are heterotrophic. They actually absorb their food. So they don't actively eat, but they absorb their food. They secrete enzymes that digest their food and they absorb them. They have cell walls around their cells, just like plants, but plant cell walls are made out of cellulose. Fungi cell walls are made out of a substance called chitin. And they're made out of little branching tube-like structures called hyphae, and you can actually see those in this picture. They're calling this a mycelium. Mycelium is actually a bigger structure. Mycelium is all the hyphae twisted together. So a single hypha is just one of these tubes, and then the twisted nature of them is the mycelium. And their reproduction is with spores, which are really tiny powdery-like structures. If you buy mushrooms at the store and you flip them upside down where the gills are, if you rub your fingers on there, you'll get like a black powder, and that's actually the spores, which is a reproductive structure of theirs. So they have a very simple reproduction. They can reproduce asexually as well, something called budding, where like a baby cell sort of grows off the parent and splits off. Sexual reproduction, the hyphae sort of cross one another, and they sort of fuse together, and then they go through meiosis, and then it makes these haploid spores that then get spread everywhere. Some examples: you're not going to be tested on the names of the families like Ascomycota or Basidiomycota, although myco, just a heads up, means fungus. Myco, actually, so mycology, for example, is the study of fungi. All I'm asking you to know is a couple of examples. So mushrooms are a very good example. Yeast, used to make bread and beer and wine, things like this. Bread mold, which is what rhizopus is. It's a mold that grows on bread. And then their role in nature. So good and bad fungi. So number one, they're used as a food source. Some organisms eat fungi, like mushrooms that we can eat. Really important in nature, decomposers. So just like some bacteria are also decomposers that break dead things down, fungi do the same thing. And when they do that, they get nutrition from that, but they also break it into elements that the plants can reabsorb, and everything sort of goes back into the ecosystem. A lot of antibiotics are made from fungi. So, for example, penicillin, the antibiotic, comes from a fungus called penicillium. It was discovered by Alexander Fleming by accident. He was growing bacteria on plates, and he discovered some of his bacteria died, and he did not know the cause, and then discovered there was some mold growing in his plate, and he basically discovered penicillin, that it's a chemical that the fungi, penicillium, the mold, was making to protect itself, because bacteria and fungi are competing for the same food. So this is like a fungus's way of knocking out the competition. But we extract antibiotics from fungi, and then we can use them to our advantage to kill bad bacteria in our bodies. Some bad funguses, ringworm is one of them, athlete's foot. These are funguses that are literally digesting your skin as food. Yeast infections, same thing. They're all caused by fungi. They can also have what are called symbiotic relationships with other organisms where they help them. A lichen, this is pronounced lichen. This is a fungus and an algae that actually live together. I'll show you a picture of one on the next slide. Fungi and termites sometimes can live in a relationship where the fungi actually break down food. Fungi and ants. And there's parasitic fungi as well that actually will grow. I showed a little video in class of that where the fungus, actually the spores get inside of an ant and they grow, and the ant becomes all disoriented, and then eventually it dies, and the fungus like sprouts out of its head and releases its spores and infects other ants. So there's a lot of different things that funguses can do. This picture on the bottom left here, this is a lichen. So if you've seen this growing on tree bark, it is a fungus that is a mutualistic relationship. It's a fungus and an algae actually growing together. The algae is photosynthetic. It makes food for the fungus. The fungus provides a structure for the algae to live in. So it's kind of interesting. All right, we're going to skip these little videos. But if you want to watch them, you can go to the original PowerPoint. And we're going to jump right into plants and go ahead and knock that out of the way as well. So we have a bit more information about plants than fungi. So plants evolved, we believe, from green algae. They are autotrophic. They are still eukaryotic as well. The pigment that they use is called chlorophyll. It's found in the chloroplasts. We've talked about photosynthesis before. Plants are multicellular. So the difference between a plant and an algae are protists because they're very simple. They live in water. They a lot of times are just single-celled. Plants are designed to live on land. So they have much stiffer structures that allow them to survive on land and are all multicellular. So this is what makes them plants. They are eukaryotic, I already mentioned. Their cells have cell walls, just like fungi and some bacteria and some protists. But specifically in plants, that cell wall is made out of a substance called cellulose. And then they're sort of broken into groups based on characteristics that they have. So the simplest plants are what are called bryophytes. Bryophytes do not have vascular tissues. Vascular tissues are vessels that carry food and water. So bryophytes do not actually have root stems, actual root stems and leaves that can transport water up and down. Tracheophytes is sort of a general name for all the plants that do have those vascular tissues. So let's talk about bryophytes first, since those are the simplest plants, probably the most primitive plants. The most common one you can think of is moss. So when you see moss growing on rocks and things like that, moss is a bryophyte. And even though it does have what look like leaves, they're not true leaves. There's no veins in them. When you look at real leaves, they actually have veins, right? If you think of a leaf, if I said, hey, draw a leaf, most people are going to draw something that looks like this. Well, these are veins that are carrying food and water back and forth through the plant. Bryophytes don't have those. So even though they look very much like a leaf, these are not actually real leaves. They also have sperm that have to have water. The sperm, to get to the egg, has to actually swim. So mosses and liverworts and hornworts, these bryophytes, always have to live in damp areas because they have to absorb their water out of the air directly, and they need water for fertilization. They have something called rhizoids, which are kind of like roots, but again, they don't really carry water very well at all. And so they are considered, like I said, the simplest of the plants. They also reproduce using spores. So very much like the fungi with those little powdery spores, these guys also reproduce with spores. Now, all the other plants are generally called tracheophytes. So tracheophytes have two special tissues to carry food and water. Xylem is the name of the one that carries water. If you've ever taken like a celery stalk and put it in a cup of water, you'll see like these little dots, and the veins will turn a color, like red, in the colored water. That's actually the xylem that you're seeing, the stringy xylem that's carrying water. And then phloem carries food. So phloem's usually carrying food that's made in the leaves down to the rest of the plant. Xylem is usually taking water from the roots up to the rest of the plant. So much more complicated. Now, the tracheophytes are subdivided into three special groups. Seedless plants, which are ferns, a couple of other things, but ferns are going to be our main example. What are called gymnosperms, which actually means naked seed plant. And then angiosperms, and these are going to be plants that make flowers and fruits. So we're going to zip right through this. So vascular tissue, just to show you, this is what they're talking about. The vascular tissue are these veins. You see the veins in the leaves, you see the veins in the stem, and they go all the way down to the roots. And this is a very blurry picture, but there's two kinds of vascular tissue. This is supposed to say the xylem and phloem. Very bad picture. But those are the veins of the plant that are carrying stuff. And remember, bryophytes don't have that. These are the seedless plants. The most common one you're probably familiar with are ferns. What makes them unique is they can grow bigger than moss because they do actually have xylem and phloem. So they do have veins, but they still use spores for reproduction, and they use swimming sperm still. So they still have to grow in areas where there's quite a bit of water because they literally need a leaf to get wet for the sperm to swim to the egg. They don't have any way of fertilizing their and making their spores other than that. And you can actually see the spores on the bottom of a fern. See here? These are called sori. These are the little spore packets on the bottom of the leaves of a fern. And so you can actually see that these are called fronds, and the sori are these areas where all the little tiny spores are located underneath. This is the baby. It's called a fiddlehead, which makes sense because it's kind of twisty. And then that'll open up and become the actual fern. Okay, and that brings us to our seed plants, which have a major, major, major advancement, and that is pollen. So pollen is actually non-swimming sperm. Inside pollen grains are sperm, but guess what? They don't have to have water for that sperm to get to eggs. It's a non-swimming sperm that can be carried by birds, insects, bees, the wind. And so these plants have the ability, all of these seed-bearing plants, to grow in places where there's not a lot of water. They still need water. They don't grow real well in deserts, most of them, but they can grow in places where there's a lot less water. Seeds are also an advancement over spores. So spores are like a powder. They're little teeny tiny things. But if you've ever opened up a seed, like if you look at a lima bean, there's all this food called the endosperm that's actually for the embryo to eat. And seeds can oftentimes withstand hostile conditions and can be transported from one place to another. Like apple seeds could be transported by, say, a bird eating the apple. The seed doesn't get digested and it comes out the other end somewhere else. And then that seed gets transported. So seeds are much more complicated, bigger than spores, and they actually have a protective coating on them. And they typically have nutrition for the embryo. So when you plant it, it actually has food to start growing. That's basically what corn is an embryo. And then all this rest of this starch is the food that if you were to actually plant the corn kernel, it would use that food as its first food to grow until it got leaves and it could make its own food. So gymnosperms and angiosperms are the two subdivisions here. Gymnosperm means naked seed. They actually are all your cone-bearing plants, like pine trees. Think of pine cones. They do make pollen, so they do not need water for fertilization, but the seeds are not really protected by anything. So they can travel by wind. So pine, juniper, sequoia, they list as examples of these. And then angiosperms are our last group. So they're the most advanced. They actually make seeds that are protected with a fruit. So it turns out that these are flowering plants, and what happens is the flowers attract insects and birds. So if you imagine this is the flower, in the middle, in here, is going to be the ovary. And usually the pollen is on these little male parts called stamen. And a bee or a bird or wind or whatever can carry the pollen to the ovary. It goes down here and fertilizes the eggs, and then that ovary will actually grow into a fruit. So that's actually what fruits are. They're actually ovaries. So if you think of an apple, it's an ovary. And inside that ovary are the seeds, the apple seeds. That would then, so the ovary protects. It actually sometimes attracts organisms that will eat the fruit and then expose the seeds. Some plants like coconuts, that's a tough outer coating. It can float to another location. And so here's a final sort of breakdown of the whole thing. So if we look at green algae as the ancestor, and then all of these past this point are all multicellular. They have something called a cuticle that protects them from drying out. Then you have your mosses, hornworts, and liverworts. These are your bryophytes. So they don't actually have veins, remember, vascular tissue. That appears here. And then you get some other things, but I had told you specifically no ferns. These guys still make spores, so they're not as advanced. They don't make seeds yet. They still have swimming sperm. And then right here is where pollen comes in. So the gymnosperms, the pine cone plants, and the angiosperms, the flowering plants, both of them make seeds and they have pollen. But the flowering plants have an additional characteristic, which is that they have an ovary inside that flower and it becomes the fruit, which protects then the seeds and helps them to get transported to other locations. And that's actually it on our entire lecture. So hopefully that was a good overview of everything from viruses to bacteria, fungi, protista, and plants.